There we go. And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to this month's Los Angeles Birders webinar. Um, Please, if you haven't joined Los Angeles Birders yet, please consider it. In fact, go ahead and do it. Go to our website at labirders.org and click on the join button. It's only $20 a year, and you support a wonderful, wonderful organization that includes live webinars like tonight. We maintain all of our webinars, maintain them all on our website for your edification, future edification. And they've been viewed how many times, Mark? Like
Oh,
some horrendous amount.
33,000.
That is a lot of viewings. Your support helps support field ornithology and community science projects. It helps support scholarships for Los Angeles Birder students. It helps support specialty projects such as migration sites in the San Gabriel Mountains and various other things. So please, please, we can use your support. Please join us. And with that, I would like to introduce Susan Gilliland, who will introduce our speaker for tonight. Susan.
Thank you, Ron. Well, Los Angeles Birders is very pleased to have Dr. Rodney Siegel here tonight. Dr. Siegel is the Executive Director of the Institute for Bird Populations, otherwise known as the IBP. The IBP is a nonprofit organization based in the Bay Area and is dedicated to studying and monitoring bird populations. The IBP collaborates locally, nationally, and globally with government agencies, universities, non-governmental organizations to assess the effects of climate change, land management actions, and other ecological stressors on bird populations, and prescribe practical solutions to conservation challenges. Dr. Siegel started as a research scientist at the IBP in 1998, and since 2008, he's been the executive director of IBP. Dr. Siegel received his BA in Environmental Studies and Political Science from Yale University and his PhD in Ecology from UC Davis. Dr. Siegel's research interests include the effects of fire and forest management on birds, conservation of meadow birds, ecology and conservation of owls, and the effects of climate change on forest birds. He's particularly interested in ecological research that has practical applications for habitat management and species conservation, and has published more than 70 scientific papers about birds and other wildlife. So without further ado, it's our great pleasure to introduce Dr. Rodney Siegel.
Thank you, Susan. I'm going to try to share my screen now.
Okay. There we go.
Okay. Are we in business?
We are in business.
We're business.
Excellent. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction. And it's really a pleasure to get to speak with such a dynamic and fun group tonight. I'm impressed with what you all are doing already. I'm particularly happy to get to talk about one of my absolute favorite bird species in the world, the great gray owl. My own work with great gray owls started in 2001 when I was a new scientist at the Institute for Bird Populations, and the Forest Service engaged us to conduct some surveys at sites with suspected but unconfirmed occupancy in the Sierra Nevada. And I jumped on that. I had at the time never seen a great gray owl before. But it wasn't too long before I did, and I was hooked. And 21 years later, I'm still hooked on great gray owls. So I want to give a caveat, though, at the beginning here, which is that I'm really, despite my passion for the species, I'm not really a great gray owl specialist. I've been doing surveys for great gray owls, kind of in fits and starts on and off over the years, and I've analyzed great gray owl data, and I've written or co-authored a bunch of papers on the ecology and conservation of great gray owls. But I have colleagues who have spent literally thousands of hours in the field looking for, finding, and observing great gray owls. And I'm not one of those people. I only wish I had the kind of familiarity with the species that they have. Rather, I'm a generalist. I study Sierra Nevada birds across many species, and this is one line of research that I maintain. And in some ways, it's one of my favorites. But again, I just want to stress that I don't have that kind of really intimate knowledge of the species that somebody who has devoted their whole career to it might have. So my plan tonight is this. First of all, because I suspect some people on the talk have never heard of the Institute for Bird Populations, or at least don't know much about us, I'm just going to very briefly introduce you to who we are and what we do. And then I'll turn to the great gray owl material, beginning with just a real quick summary of great gray owl natural history. And then I'm going to dive much deeper into habitat use and habitat selection, specifically by great gray owls in California, referencing some research and some papers that colleagues and I published in the last decade on those topics. After that, I'm going to turn my attention to two potential big stressors on great gray owls in California: the changing fire regime, and then more broadly, climate change in general. Again, referencing some papers that are either recently published by our group or are in press right now. And then at the end of my talk, I'm just going to give you a very brief sneak preview of some work we have just started in Yosemite National Park this year that's in progress. All right, so the Institute for Bird Populations, or IBP, was founded in 1989 by Dr. Dave DeSanti, who I suspect some of you on the webinar might know or have known. I'm sorry to say Dave passed away earlier this fall, which was a big blow to all of us. But in any case, we're based in Petaluma, California. We are a nonprofit with a mission of enabling science-based conservation of species and habitats by studying the abundance, demography, and ecology of birds and other wildlife. Currently, we have 17 year-round scientists on staff, and then every spring and summer, our ranks swell by dozens of seasonal field biologists who collect most of the data that make things flow here. One of our major programs is coordination of the MAPS program, which stands for Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship. It's a continent-wide coordinated bird banding program. We also established and coordinate its sister program in Latin America, the MOSI program. Aside from those two programs, which are sort of hemispheric, we have projects primarily in the Pacific Northwest, the Sierra Nevada, the Southwest, and Pacific Islands that focus on studying population responses to climate change, fire, and forest management. We do surveys and conservation planning for species of concern. We advise land managers on bird-friendly habitat management and habitat restoration techniques. We design and implement long-term monitoring programs, often incorporating emerging technologies. And we put a lot of emphasis on scientific publishing, with our staff here typically publishing at least 15 or so scientific papers per year. If you're interested in learning more, please visit us at birdpop.org. There's a lot of information about what we do there. And then I want to emphasize that we are indeed a nonprofit. And so if you are inspired by what we do, please consider making a tax-deductible nonprofit donation to the Institute. Okay, I'm going to talk about owls now. Promise. So great gray owls have a bit of a mystique here in North America. I think a lot of it due to the essentially true perception that they are the largest owl in North America. The table here gives you body lengths. That's from like the tip to the bottom of the tail of our larger North American owl species, and you can see that indeed the great gray owl is the largest one. But the owl harbors a bit of a secret in that while the linear dimension is the greatest, by weight, snowy owl and great horned owl are both considerably larger than great gray owls and have much larger feet, which is really the business end of an owl. Great gray owls actually have the longest tail of any owl species that's extant today, as well as copious floof and ploof on the head, making them in some ways appear bigger than the warm bird inside really is. In terms of the appearance, tearing off of that, the identification of an adult great gray owl is generally not too hard. Some of the key features, this is an illustration from David Sibley's guide. Key features include the large gray facial disc. Sibley doesn't point it out, but the really kind of bright yellow eyes and the yellowish bill. The black and white bow tie that's evident both in the illustration and in the photograph on the right. The overall muted gray pattern of the plumage. And then in two of my favorite words in the entire Sibley guide, he lists as a field mark, imposing presence, which I think is a wonderful and whimsical way of describing something important about great gray owls. It's really true. Sometimes the fledglings, identification of fledglings trips people up a little more than the adults, but it's really not that hard if you just key in on the right things. In terms of differentiating them from the other large owl fledglings that you might be likely to confuse them with. This is a great gray owl fledgling on the far left. This is a great horned owl fledgling in the middle and a spotted owl fledgling on the far right. The key things to focus in on, I would say, in the great gray owl are the overall gray plumage, the yellow eyes, and the yellow bill. And if you look for all those three things, you're pretty unlikely to go wrong. In terms of diet, great gray owls in California feed primarily on voles and pocket gophers, which they most typically forage for in and around the edges of montane meadows, like this great gray owl in the middle of the photograph is doing. This is a really typical hunting position for a great gray owl. They like to forage on low perches, like the one you see there, where they can scan the ground for rodents. But that isn't all they eat. Excuse me. They've been documented in California to consume many other food items, including deer mice, beetles, small birds, young rabbits, alligator lizards, and more. But the great bulk of the diet, indeed, is voles and pocket gophers. The species has a Holarctic range, meaning that it occupies high latitudes across the entire northern hemisphere, not just in North America. So it occurs in boreal forest across Europe and Asia, as well as Alaska and Canada. And then it has this sort of finger that points down into the Rockies and then down again, much further south, here into California in the Sierra Nevada, where we have by far the most southerly great gray owls. And this sort of extreme southern extension of the range sets up our California birds to occur in and deal with habitat conditions and indeed habitats that are really quite different from anywhere else the species occurs across its range. And that's a theme I'll be coming back to again in a few minutes. Here in California, the delving a little more deeply into that, the bird is primarily restricted to the western slopes of the central Sierra Nevada. Some years ago, 2016, I think, colleagues and I compiled all of the nest records we could find going back to the 1970s. And we've mapped them here. Again, this was done in 2015, so there are undoubtedly some newer nests that aren't on here, but this gives you a snapshot of everything we could compile at that time. The pluses on the map indicate actual observed nests, and the red dots are places where fledglings were observed. No nest was found, but the fledglings were so young that the nest had to have been nearby. So you can see that the bulk of the range is really quite compact there in the central Sierra Nevada, kind of centered on Yosemite National Park. But there are a couple of outliers in the record, including that one up in the Modoc Plateau in northeastern California, and another one in the northwest in Siskiyou County. Okay, so now I'm going to delve into that in some more detail. I'm going to talk about habitat use and habitat selection within California. The set of results, the first set of results I'm going to show come from this paper, which was a collaboration between myself and some colleagues here at IBP, and pretty much anyone else who's done systematic nest surveys for great gray owls in California over the last 2 decades. So I'm much appreciative of people that share data. Excuse me. Nest site availability has been proposed as one of the possible limiting factors on this very small population that we have in California. And unfortunately, until recently, it hadn't ever really been systematically described. Most of the information about great gray owl nest sites was more like an accumulation of anecdote rather than a systematic effort. And so what we did is we compiled all the nest records we could find that had coordinates. And in 2015, I believe, 2016, we went and visited all of those sites that we were able to access. And we looked for the nest trees. In most cases, we were able to actually find the nest tree, even if the nest record itself might have been from 10, 20, 30 years ago. And we collected measurements on the nest trees, and we conducted habitat assessments of the surrounding landscape. So, in all, we visited 51 nest sites. We didn't get all of the variables we wanted to measure from every nest site. In some cases, like we found the nest tree, but it had snapped off, for example, since the nesting event. And so we couldn't measure how tall the tree was. So there's little bits and pieces of missing data like that. But in general, the sample size on these is about 50 nests. So I'll just give you some summary information here. Of all those 50 or so, 43 in this case, nest trees that we were able to measure, the mean DBH, or diameter at breast height, of those trees was just over 100 centimeters, which is a large tree, which is not so surprising because it's a large owl, and the nests need to contain, a couple of nestlings in a good year, as well as a parent protecting them. So that's a real constraint and a real theme in great gray owl conservation, is they need nesting structures that are large enough to support their own big size. The other thing I'll call your attention to in the table here is the bottom line, which is canopy cover. The average canopy cover around those nest trees was about 82%, which is substantial. That's a pretty dark closed canopy forest. And so that's another theme we see in great gray owl conservation, is that the owls really do seem to prefer nesting in closed canopy forest. They often like to have some shade actually over the nest cavity itself, which likely provides just some basic thermal cover for the nestlings on warmer afternoons. And it also gives the nestlings an opportunity to do what's called branching when they're ready, which is when they leave the nest, but they're not actually ready to fly yet, but they're just getting restless. They start climbing around on whatever vegetation is available that they can reach. And so having some forest structure around the nest is really helpful to them for that reason. But going into some more detail on those nests we visited, here we've shown the species identity of all the nest trees that we visited. And you can see the most common nest tree type of all the nests that have been found is red fir, which wasn't a big surprise because many of the anecdotal detections that people have accumulated over the years indeed are in red fir. What was more of a surprise was that the second most common nest tree species was black oak. I don't think any of us had expected that there would be so many nests in oaks. Other species with multiple multiple great gray owl nests included white fir and ponderosa pine. And then there were much lower numbers of nests in lodgepole pine, valley oak, Douglas fir, and even gray pine, which was a real surprise. The other thing this graph shows you is the status of each of those trees. Was it live or dead at the time of nesting? And so the interesting pattern here is that nearly all of the conifers that were used for nesting were dead at the time of nesting, whereas the majority of the oaks were still alive. And so that in itself gives some important direction to land managers interested in prioritizing retention of potential nesting structures, understanding that it's really the conifer snags that are important and the big gnarled but still living. So we also looked into we classified the actual nest structures that were being used within those nest trees. And far and away, the majority of the conifer species were using, the birds were using what we call broken top nests, where like the nest in the picture there, this is where the tree died. And then sometime after it died, the top of it snapped off, probably in a windstorm or something. And then that top part of the remaining snag starts getting rot and a bowl develops in it. And that is just sort of the perfect nesting structure for great gray owls, provided the other landscape elements are in place. In the oaks that have a different structure, the birds use a variety of different nooks and crannies and cavities in the big gnarled oaks, especially where a big branch might have sloughed off the main trunk and then some rot got in there and a big cavity develops. Some of the other kinds of structures we found in small numbers were mistletoe brooms and stick nests of other bird species. And that's an interesting one because elsewhere in great gray owl's range, the majority of nests are stick nests of other bird species like ravens. But here in California, that's a very rare phenomenon. We don't know why. And then I just wanted to show you pictures of some of those nest trees that we visited. On the top row here from left to right, that's a big red fir snag. Then comes the ponderosa pine snag, a lodgepole pine snag, and then there's a living ponderosa pine with some weird growth pattern that created some weird nooks and crannies in there for with nesting opportunities. Then on the bottom line, it's mostly oaks, mostly black oaks, but I wanted to point out the gray pine image, tree number 6 there. Was probably the biggest surprise of all the trees we visited. I actually personally visited this tree and it was the biggest gray pine I have ever seen anywhere, which is why it was big enough to hold a great gray owl nest. Actually in that hole that you see in the bottom of in the lower portion of the trunk there, that's where they were nesting. I don't imagine there are very many, if any, other gray pines hosting great gray owl nests, but it's pretty neat that the one where it happened got found. Maybe there's a few others out there. I don't know. Oh yeah, and then here's a bonus image. This site wasn't even in our study, but this is, I showed you on the map of nest sites, there was one nest site way up on the Modoc Plateau, and this is it. This is a nest that was in a ponderosa pine up there in far northeastern California. And as you can see, it really wasn't even a big pine. It was a small pine. But it had a mistletoe broom in it with a nice platform that held a great gray owl nest. And then I want to mention too that some of these odd smaller trees that were able to hold great gray owl nests because of their interesting structural characteristics all go into that average I gave you of 101 centimeters for DBH. In terms of nests that are actually have the birds nesting literally in the trunk, the DBH of those on average was even larger. So putting all these sites we visited together, the elevation range of these nests was about 700 meters to 2,400 meters, which corresponds to about 2,300 feet to 7,900 feet above sea level, if you think in feet. And the upper end of that is about what we expected, but all that activity on the lower end was quite a bit more than we thought. We hadn't expected to find very many nests below 4,000 feet, but clearly they were out there. In terms of the overall forest composition around these, in these landscapes, we had Sierra mixed conifer, red fir, white fir, lodgepole pine, and montane hardwood conifer mix were the main ones. So even though the nests were embedded in forests of those forest types, another important element of the nest was that they tended to be near montane meadows. These are all photos taken near nest sites. And the owls are presumably doing most of their foraging in these meadows, just a short hop and a skip away from their nest. Now to put some quantitative data behind that statement. This is a graph indicating how far from meadows the nests generally were. So the x-axis is distance from meadow, the y-axis is the cumulative probability, which we've divided up into low, medium, and high elevation nests because we found an interesting pattern there. The higher elevation nests, indicated by the dashed line, really did tend to be very consistently near meadow edges. And in fact, looking at this graph, about almost 90% of them were within about 250, 270 meters of a montane meadow. Then the mid-elevation nests, indicated by the dotted line, were a little bit less tied to montane meadows. It was about 80% of them that were within about 250 meters or just a little more from a montane meadow. And then for the low elevation nests, the majority of them were still near meadows, but you can see the coupling gets looser and looser. And in fact, about 35 to 40% of those nests were actually more than 750 meters from the nearest meadow. So we got increasingly interested in what was going on here at the lower right portion of the graph. What kind of habitat were these particular birds keying in on where there weren't montane meadows, since we think of these so strongly as being meadow bird species? So fortunately, we had an opportunity to kind of find out. We partnered with Kevin Roberts, who is a wildlife biologist for Sierra Pacific Industries, the timber company. Around 2005, Kevin started finding great gray owls on SPI land in relatively low elevation, oak dominated woodlands. And before that time, no one had really described great gray owls using this habitat in California before, but he was finding multiple nests and he monitored them over about a decade and took some real good data. So he partnered with us, what was the date here, 2016, I think, to consolidate his field notes into a manuscript, sort of documenting what was going on with these lower elevation nests that didn't really fit the pattern, didn't fit the mold we had of what great gray owls did in California. So the next set of results I'll show you come from this paper. The study area, it was a parcel of SPI land or a bunch of adjacent parcels spanning the border of Amador and El Dorado counties right here. The nests that we assessed for that paper are indicated by the gray triangles. Kevin actually subsequently found more nests in the greater area after he published that paper, but this is what the paper is based on. So one of the questions we had about these sites was, okay, the birds are nesting there, but how do we know they're nesting successfully? I mean, it's possible that something about the habitat there was attracting great gray owls to nest, and then maybe they weren't really so able to raise young there. Maybe the nests were mostly failing, and this was sink habitat. So that was one of the first things we wanted to look into. Fortunately, Kevin had great notes. He'd monitored the nest attempts and could document that the great majority of them actually were successful. And when we looked even closer than that, we looked at the number of young produced per breeding attempt, and it was at least in line with other studies from different parts of great gray owl's range. In particular, the number of young per observed breeding attempt was higher in this low montane area than had anecdotally been observed in nearby Yosemite. So it seemed pretty clear that this is not sink habitat. There was something more important going on here than that. The birds, it seemed to be a self-sustaining population where the birds are nesting successfully. So the next thing we wanted to do was make something like a predictive model. We wanted to characterize the landscape where these birds were nesting, and then use that to identify other places in the lower elevations of the Sierra's western slope where there might be similar undiscovered populations of great gray owls. To this day, we still don't know, we'll never know, I suppose, whether there were great gray owls in that region where Kevin found those birds for millennia, or whether they only recently colonized the area. We don't know why they weren't discovered until the early 2000s. So the possibility is certainly there that there are other undiscovered small populations throughout the lower montane Sierra. So we used a statistical technique called maximum entropy modeling to characterize the landscape around these nests, and then apply that to data from up and down the whole Sierra Nevada, try to identify patches of intriguingly similar habitat in the thinking that those might also host great gray owls. So this figure is our output from that model and that extrapolation. The figure on the panel on the right is just an expansion of the boxed area within the panel on the left so that you can see it better. But basically what's going on here is anything that's colored a color other than dark blue has an intriguingly high similarity to the landscape where those great gray owls were nesting on SPI lands. And so those are the places where it really makes sense to go looking hard and systematically for potentially cryptic undiscovered great gray owls. Now it's to my kind of great frustration, we still haven't managed to do that. This is a project we've been trying to get funded for a decade and just haven't really clicked with it. So I think there are some really intriguing habitat patches up there in the Northern Sierra that need to be explored. The whole known statewide population of great gray owls is somewhere around 100 pairs. So even if there are just a few more pairs lurking out there in some of these spots, it would really be valuable to know where they are. The other caveat I want to give about this output is that the model that we built was trained entirely from those sites in the Northern Sierra Nevada. And that's probably why all of the similar places that it identified are also in the northern half of the Sierra Nevada. I think it would be great to get some, to do more surveys in the south. If we could find some occupied spots in low elevation areas of the Southern Sierra, we could revamp this model and come up with something that would probably be more useful Sierra-wide, if indeed there are birds using those habitats in the south. We're going to have some opportunity, our own crews this summer, we're doing owl surveys on Stanislaus National Forest just north of Yosemite. And I think we're going to be able to do some systematic surveys in lower elevation parts of that forest this summer. So I'm excited about that. Okay, I'm going to switch gears here. Let me just look at time. Okay. I'm going to talk now about the first of two major potential stressors on great gray owl populations in California. The first one is wildfire and the changing fire regime happening in California. This next set of results all come from this paper, which I published with lots of colleagues a few years back. It was another one of these cooperative endeavors where I'm really grateful. Basically, everybody who was doing systematic great gray owl surveys in California during the last 15 years shared their data, and we were able to do one unified analysis. The analysis itself was led by my great friend and colleague, the brilliant Dr. Morgan Tingley at UCLA. So kudos to him for that. So people probably are well aware that the fire regime in California is changing rapidly. We're seeing more acres burned every year on average. Even though 2022 was a relatively mild fire year, the trend is still unmistakable and probably accelerating. We'll see. And that's caused some concern for wildlife species dependent on late cirral forest characteristics. There's a big concern that if these trends continue, we could literally, or at least nearly, run out of late cirral forest in the Sierra Nevada. The other, or another phenomenon that has emerged with regard to fire is the prevalence of so-called mega fires that burn enormous areas, starting from a single ignition or several ignitions related to the same storm event sometimes. One of the earlier fires to get this designation of a mega fire, this in the 21st century here, was the Rim Fire, which burned in 2013. It started on Stanislaus National Forest and burned eastward across a big chunk of the forest and into Yosemite. It burned 250,000 acres. But most relevant for the talk tonight, it really burned in the center of Great Gray Owl's Range in California. So it kind of presented an important test case for looking at what are the likely effects of fire on this bird species. We know that birds in general occur on a continuum. Some bird species, like the ones on the right here, are quite tied to later cirral forest conditions, like closed canopy or large trees. Some of these species really tend to disappear after stand replacing fire. Whereas other species, like the ones on the left here, are actually not only tolerant of fire, but they can thrive in severely burned areas shortly after the fire. So we didn't really know a priori where great gray owls might fall on this spectrum. Certainly there were reasons to think they would be vulnerable because they do depend or at least associate with late cirral forest, heavy canopy cover, large trees, which are all jeopardized by stand replacing fire. But on the other hand, well, I'll get into the reasons afterward, but we did have some anecdotal records of great gray owls nesting in burned areas. This is an older photograph from Yosemite National Park from prior to that study that we did. This is a great gray owl nest in a giant lodgepole pine in the middle of a relatively small patch of high severity burned forest. And the nest was right there in the top of the bole of that tree. And the nest, at least in that year, succeeded. Those are two fledglings that, well, maybe they hadn't even fledged yet, and they were just branching, like I talked about before. The nest was there inside the main trunk, but they were climbing out, exploring the branches there. But this was an example of a successful nest in a burned area. So we weren't sure what we were going to find. So to zero in a little more on where the fire is, the rim fire was, the map on the left you've seen before. Those are our known nest sites in California as of 2015. And then the photograph, the aerial photograph on the right, a satellite image here on the right, is the actual fire in progress burning. That's its smoke plume of the rim fire going up through the center and top of the photograph. And you can see it's really, if you match it up with the photo on the left, it's just right there in the thick of things in terms of the great gray owl population. So again, we weren't quite sure what to expect. We know that some parts of the rim fire burned in large areas with almost 100% mortality of trees, like this. But then other areas, particularly around meadow edges, where the soil is wetter, seem to be more protected, and many trees survived. Here in this image around the meadow, you can see a lot of large trees, medium to large trees around the meadow edge survived. And so it's possible that the trees in the places where the great gray owls actually need them were the ones most likely to make it through the fire. So again, we weren't sure what we would find. What we did was we collated all the systematic survey efforts and results from great gray owl surveys in the 10 years prior to the rim fire. So that's 2004 through 2012. And the 3 years after the fire. No, I said that wrong. Sorry. The fire was in the fall of 2013. So the 10 years before was 2004 through 2013. And then the 3 years after the fire, 2014 through 2016. We collated all those results from different agencies, different researchers, and put them all together. So this map shows you the raw data. The square on the right is just a blow up of the section of it indicated on the left, so you can see it better. But let me orient you here. The dark green blob is Yosemite National Park. The light green area is Stanislaus National Forest. And then the purple and pink blob there is the actual footprint of the rim fire. So every one of these circles indicates a meadow that was systematically surveyed for great gray owls at least once during that period of 2004 to 2016. The way the symbology works is the circle is bisected in half, and the left side of the circle indicates the pre-fire survey results, regardless of the number of surveys or the number of years in which that site was actually surveyed prior to the fire. So if the left half of the circle is white, it means no systematic surveys were conducted during 2004 to 2013 prior to the fire. If the left half is gray, it means surveys were conducted in at least 1 year, but no owls were detected. And if the left side is black, it means surveys were conducted, again, in at least 1 year, although possibly as frequently as every year, and owls were detected in at least 1 year prior to the fire. And then the right side of the circle has the same symbology, but it's for after the fire, those 3 years after the fire. So what you can see by looking at these circles, even just focusing on the ones in the box there that I zoomed in on, is that most of the circles that were black, meaning they were occupied at some point prior to the fire, were still occupied after the fire. I think you can pretty well pull that out of just the raw data. Nevertheless, we went and built a sophisticated mathematical model. So again, this was led by Morgan Tingley, who used hierarchical Bayesian modeling to assess occupancy by great gray owls before and after the fire, and identify potential covariates that could help us understand the results. I'm not going to get into the model itself at all tonight, but just go right to the results. So the panel on the left there, panel A, is all of those sites pooled. There were 144 of them that were surveyed at least once during the study period. And the bars indicate estimates of the proportion of those sites that were occupied in that year. They're estimates because, as I said, not every site was surveyed in every year. So that's where the math comes in, is figuring out the range of likely values, given that not all the sites were actually surveyed each year. So what you can see here is that in the pre-fire period, 2004 to 2012, the proportion of occupied meadows was quite steady, somewhere around 0.6. The fire happened in the fall of 2013, and then, contrary to possible expectations of maybe the occupancy rate going down, it actually went up. It went up quite a bit. So that was interesting. Then we dove a little deeper. We disaggregated that result according to meadows that were actually inside the fire, as opposed to those that were within our larger study area, but were outside the fire. And lo and behold, they were the same. It was the same pattern and even the same occupancy rates, essentially. At least they were indistinguishable. So that gives us a clue that perhaps whatever caused that increase in occupancy rates after the fire maybe wasn't even related to the fire. Maybe it was related to climate cycles or some other factor besides the fire. We also disaggregated the sites by whether they were in Yosemite or outside Yosemite, figuring that the management histories would be quite divergent. And kind of as expected, the overall occupancy rate within the park was quite a bit higher than outside the park, but the overall patterns were similar. And then we looked at a few other parameters as well. Panel A is the probability of colonization, which is, given that a site was actually not occupied 1 year, what was the probability that it was occupied the next year? And we can see that colonization probability was quite low prior to the fire. And then interestingly, after the fire, it went up. We also looked at the probability of persistence, which is, given that a site was occupied 1 year, what's the probability that it was occupied again the following year? And you can see those were uniformly high. That would maybe just a hint that that also went up after the fire. So in a nutshell, what does all this mean? Well, it seems like the owls were quite resilient to what seemed like a worst case scenario fire for great gray owls in California, given its location. Now, factors unrelated to the fire might have caused that post-fire increase, but at least the fire didn't cause a decrease. It didn't prevent that increase from happening, and it didn't actually cause a decrease. So we kind of tentatively conclude that fire, at least based on this example, this one fire, isn't a major threat to the population. Maybe. The question mark is definitely still there, though, because this was a very short-term study. We only looked at the great gray owl population 3 years after the fire. It's possible that deleterious effects might have emerged later. It's possible that individual great gray owls that held territories were unwilling to leave their territories, even if territory quality declined. And for those reasons, it would be great to get out there and do another big systematic survey. Particularly, we're a decade out now. Probably the individual identity of most of the owls that hold territories across the region has turned over. They're new birds now, who've gotten the opportunity to select their habitat within the post-fire landscape. So it would be really great to get out there and do some follow-up surveys. Okay, now I'm going to broaden the topic in a way just a bit, although this is going to be a short component. Moving from effects of fire on great gray owls, I want to talk about predicting potential future effects of climate change in general. Now, we know that the changing fire regime is in part driven by climate change itself, but the effects of climate change in the Sierra ecosystems is broader than that as well. For example, we know we're seeing widespread conifer tree mortality due to drought. And we're also seeing ecological changes in montane meadows, where due to drought and earlier snowmelt and warmer summer temperatures, meadows are drying out more and potentially bringing in a host of ecological changes. So we were interested in trying to get at the effects of, trying to project future of great gray owl meadow habitats in the Sierra Nevada out through the rest of the century. So we used a technique called boosted regression tree modeling. Essentially what we did was gather data from all of the sites known to have been occupied in recent years, recent decades, I should say. We included two kinds of data. We included geophysical variables like soil type and slope that essentially provide the template for meadow conditions to develop given favorable climatic conditions. And we also included climatic conditions like average precipitation and temperature. And then we use the modeling approach to identify sites throughout the Sierra Nevada might hold combinations of those traits that support great gray owls today. So again, the figure on the far left here are the sites that we had data from. We took a subset of that data to build the model, and then we used that to predict current occupancy of meadows in the Sierra Nevada. And so the extent to which the map on the left and the map on the center show concordance, that's sort of a test of how good our model was. Was it sufficient for what we were trying to do? And we were quite happy with the concordance here. So then based on that model, we used we used data, projected data from 4 different climate models under a high carbon emission scenario. We used the average of 4 different models to identify sites throughout the region that would host conditions that great gray owls currently find suitable out through the end of the century, culminating in the period 2070 to 2099, which is what I've mapped there on the far right. So what you can see here, it's not a worst case scenario. There are still sites that look like they're appropriate for great gray owls. But except for those odd 2 sites that popped up in the Tahoe Basin, the remaining sites are much more tightly clustered than they are today. And we've shed many of them, lots of sites that either further north or further south and lower elevation have fallen out of that window that we've defined of suitable characteristics. A few new sites have popped in that are higher elevation that aren't currently used by great gray owls. So maybe there's a little bit of hope there for assuming that the owls have the dispersal and the adaptation capacity to use and find those sites. But I stress, we're not actually predicting here where great gray owls are going to be at the end of the century. Rather, we're predicting where appropriate habitat might be. And we don't know if owls will find and use that habitat. Summing that up, we did not assess the capacity of owls to adapt to conditions that they're not currently experiencing. And so that's an important caveat. It could be that they have more plasticity in what they can tolerate than we expect. In any case, though, climate change seems likely to render unsuitable many of the sites that the owls are currently using and that are suitable, but also to make suitable some sites that the owls are currently not using. Like I emphasized, suitability does not ensure that new sites will actually be colonized by individual owls. On balance, it seems like the owls are going to lose suitable habitat over the coming decades, making conservation efforts even more important. Okay, just the last thing I want to touch on tonight is just to give you this quick snapshot of some research in progress that we just started this past spring. This is a partnership between IVP, Yosemite National Park, and the Teton Raptor Center. It came about because the Park Service is initiating some hydrologic restoration and vegetation management projects that are likely to affect great gray owl habitat in the park. And they were looking for some research that would help inform and design those projects to make them as owl-friendly as possible. So the projects, really, there are two kinds of projects. There are hydrologic restoration work in meadows that should improve overall ecology and hydrologic functioning of those meadows, but it is going to create changes. And we felt that knowing more detail about individual owls' habitat selection within a meadow would be really valuable to understand things like soil moisture gradients and the mix of woody and herbaceous vegetation in the places where the owls are choosing to forage or not choosing to forage could be really helpful in designing some of these projects so that the resulting habitat is to the owls' liking. And then in terms of the vegetation management work, the park is initiating some vegetation management along roadsides to try to reduce the risk of fire. And some of these stretches of roads pass through great gray owl territories. So we think there's actually an opportunity here. Turns out road strikes is a major source of mortality for great gray owls in California and in Yosemite in particular. These are all the road strike records that we were able to compile back in 2015, I believe. But I think these are just the tip of the iceberg. These were the owls that got picked up by people and reported, and the data got preserved. I know there have been many more, even since that date, that I know of. The owls get hit by cars quite a bit. So the idea here is if we could learn more about how the owls in Yosemite are using habitat along the roads, we could use this vegetation management work to try to nudge the roadside vegetation into a state within existing owl territories into a state that's more discouraging than encouraging for the great gray owls to hang out and forage. And hopefully they would then be less likely to get hit by cars. So our objectives then were to describe fine scale habitat selection, both inside meadows where we could identify the preferred habitat characteristics for hunting and roosting, and then also along roadsides that pass through owl territories where we could try to come up with a suite of characteristics of vegetation that might discourage great gray owl usage. And then we could use all of those results to inform more owl-friendly management within the park. So last spring, we GPS tagged 5 great gray owls in 4 meadows. These are just some very preliminary results. the owls are still wearing the GPS tags and are still collecting data right now and will be through next summer. But these are the data that were downloaded, I think, in August. On these 4 graphs, each of them represents a different owl territory and in a different portion of the park. Each of the little yellow tiny specks is an actual GPS coordinate fix on that owl. The GPS tags are collecting during the breeding season. They were collecting fixes every hour. And during the non-breeding season, it's every 8 hours. And then we've also got days sprinkled in throughout where they're getting fixes up to every 5 minutes. So that's what those dots are. And then the color blob there is just applying a little bit of math to come up with a sort of a model of the density of usage for each of those home ranges so far, with the red color being the most intensely used area, and then yellow intermediate and green lower. You can see those summer home ranges are about 2 to 3 kilometers across on the longest axis. And these data are still really preliminary, but we've already got some interesting surprises. One of these owls has been consistently leaving its nice sheltered meadow and foraging along the highway about 1 kilometer away from its meadow. So that was an interesting revelation, and we'll be getting in there in the spring to try to figure out what's so attractive along this stretch of highway. Another one of the birds has been regularly foraging in a second meadow, a smaller one, about 2 kilometers away from the place where it's nesting. And what's interesting about this is Yosemite is known for years and years and years that both of these sites regularly have nesting, or regularly have great gray owls during the nesting season. But I don't think anybody ever suspected they might be the same owl, because they're far enough apart, like 2 kilometers, with lots of forest and other features in between. But at least in 2022, these 2 meadows are being held by the same owl, which makes us now wonder about our population estimates for the birds as well, if that turns out to be a widespread phenomenon. Anyway, we'll be doing a lot more work on these, including some on-the-ground observations of foraging owls and on-the-ground characterization of their hunting perches and the habitat they're using, and hopefully coming up with some good lessons about how to manage meadows and how to manage roadside vegetation for the park. Okay, I want to end with one last thought. I hope you find great gray owls as majestic and intriguing as I do. But because I also want to emphasize that the birds are sensitive to disturbance. And there's at least one well-documented case of a probable nesting failure in Yosemite that appeared to be due to overly eager recreational birders and photographers. So I just want to put out there request to everyone to be careful. And I'm going to give David Gaines's quote here. David Gaines was the author of this terrific book, Birds of Yosemite and the East Slope. And he wrote, "Let's leave these great owls in peace, shun their nest sites and roosts, and observe, if at all, from discreet distances." I think that's the key. Let us treat them with the respect and reverence they deserve. So that's my plea to you, if you do go out looking for great gray owls, to please treat them with respect and reverence so they can continue to thrive. Lastly, I just want to give acknowledgement and thanks to my many, many co-authors who helped develop all of the results that I shared with you tonight. And I'm going to stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Rodney.
My pleasure.
That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Just to everyone out there, please, if you have questions, pop them into our Q&A down at the bottom of your screen. That helps us kind of keep track of everything that's going through. And hopefully we'll be able to get Rodney out of here by midnight, 1 a.m. the latest.
Yeah. So I have a question. Do you have recommended references and sources if people want to know more about the biology of great gray owls, generally or in California?
Yeah, why Well, actually, one thing I'll send you to in a self-interested way is that my colleagues and I wrote a conservation strategy for great gray owl that's available on our website at birdpop.org. And then you have to do some now. I'll send you a link if you can distribute it. I can send you a link to that document as well as to some other sources that I like.
Okay, that'd be great. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, we'll put that on our website along with this, along with the video.
Great.
So Gregory asked, did fires increase nesting habitat with dead trees, and would fires have affected voles in montane meadows?
Yeah, those are great questions. And we have lots of hypotheses, but not a whole lot of answers. It certainly stands to reason that fire-killed trees can and will become potential nesting trees, provided that they have the right characteristics. There's, I guess the risk there is that probably immediately after a fire in the early years, there's going to be a bunch of good nesting structures developing for great gray owls, but it's short term. And so if it's a really high severity fire that didn't leave a lot of large living trees, you're going to have all of your potential nesting structures start to decay and perhaps falling down within 10, 20 years. And then you've really got a problem. And that's why I said in some cases it might be a longer term process for the negative consequences of the fire to develop. But we also know that at least in the sites that I've looked at more carefully, all the trees around the meadow edges didn't die. There are a lot of live trees still standing. And so that might not be such a problem. We'll see. The other half, or the other portion of the question, was really interesting too. Yeah, the fire probably did affect the dynamics of the pocket gophers and the voles. We don't have good hard data on that, so I can't really answer the question, but it stands to reason that would be the case. And in fact, we've seen a similar thing that's been studied better in spotted owls, where there is indeed a pulse of wood rats in some habitat after fire, and there's a lot of food there for the owls in the early years after the fire. So there could be something similar going on with great grays.
Okay, great, thank you. John and Erica asked, was vole gopher population success studied as part of the climate change review, or is that just part of the viable owl habitat?
Yeah, so that's not something that we've studied at all. There are a couple of good papers on vole and gopher populations in California, even in great gray owl habitat in particular. The first author is Ryan Kalinowski, who's a Forest Service biologist. So if somebody wants to Google around, you can probably find his work on that. But I don't have any easy answers for you. Yeah, complicated processes, and it's also really hard to study effects of events like so-called catastrophic fires when you don't know when and where they're going to burn. And so it's really hard to get before and after data on events like that. Although I'm sure there are rodent experts who know way more about this than I'm suggesting. So.
All right, great. Lance asked, what about a proximity of great gray owls to vocalizing great horned spotted and barred owls and even northern goshawks?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There does seem to be some, well, I mean, probably outright predation, but also more generally some exclusion, particularly between I think great grays and great horns. The great horns, of course, are more aggressive and bigger and meaner. And in fact, when we do vocal surveys for great gray owls, if we get a great horned owl response, we terminate the survey because we don't want to be calling in a great horned owl right to where we're potentially causing a great gray owl to vocalize. So yeah, it's one of those things. If we could have perfect knowledge and at the same time that we're doing this other kind of work, to also know the distribution of these other interacting species on the landscape, it probably is part of the story.
And Ted Kyle has popped a couple of addresses into the chat. You might want to go and grab those. One is to the paper that was referenced by Rodney earlier on the birdpop.org website.
great. Thanks for finding I see somebody found the Kalinowski paper, which is
And
great.
Okay. Yeah, I'll have to do that before we quit and try unless
They go
somebody else
away,
wants to
right?
copy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gonna go away. So unless somebody else wants to copy that down while I'm looking at questions, that'd be great. So Mary asks, Canada has experienced fires. How does that reflect on their breeding success in northern Canada?
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I'm sorry. It's a great question. I don't have any answers at hand. I don't even know to what extent it's been studied.
Okay, great. And then we have another question from Tom, which is similar to a previous one about the fire must have a huge effect on the owl's prey base. And have you studied this?
Yeah. So again, we have not. I will say even within these high severity fires, the effects on the actual wet meadow sometimes is less severe than you might think. Sometimes the willows catch on fire or something, but often there are big patches of herbaceous vegetation that don't even burn. I've seen that a lot where there was standing water on the meadow when the fire came through or something like that. But of course, sometimes they do burn up too. So it's a good question.
Okay, great. I'm going to skip because I see a question by Lance. It's also almost very similar. It seems like there's a need to survey prey species in the vicinity of nests. Are you doing that, or is someone doing that?
Yeah, I would refer you again to that Kalinowski paper. It's probably the best source on that. We are not doing that. We have not done that. I do think it is for sure an important part of understanding their distribution. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Oh, but the other thing too, I'll add though, is that the home ranges, as I showed, are large. These are owls foraging over a big blob with a 2 or 3 kilometer diameter. So there, in some places, there are a lot of potential nooks and crannies to be looking for prey species.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let's see, Mary asks if there have been any surveys in Tulare County.
Yeah, actually, I did some a bazillion years ago. Like 20 years ago, maybe 18 years ago. I don't know, but there are a couple of sites on Sequoia National Forest with historical records where people thought they detected great gray owls. And we followed up on some of those 1 or 2 years. I forget how many times with some intensive surveys at some of those meadows. And we did not find anything. And I don't think at any of those sites anyone has found great gray owls there since, although I don't think any systematic studies have gone on either.
Okay, great, thank you. Alex asked, in the post-fire areas with the circles that were originally black and turned white, do you know why the owl was left? Was it lack of food or lack of preferred nest trees?
No, we don't know that. This was a compilation of just survey data. And so we don't have, unfortunately, the kind of high resolution data where somebody might have been tracking or observing those birds trying to figure out what they were doing. We just know that surveyors got back there at least 1 year after the fire and there were no owls. And I wish we had more detailed mechanistic information than that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yvonne asks, the height of the nests in the oak tree seems to be quite a bit lower than those in the conifers. Is there?
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
About that?
I think that largely reflects where the cavities and the other nesting structures tend to develop in those trees. I don't think the owls really care that. This is my guess. The owls really care that much how high off the ground they are. I mean, they need to be clear of ground-based predators, I suppose. But I don't think they're real sensitive to that. And I think it just depends on where that tree species tends to develop its big cavities.
Okay. Okay. Lance asks, speaking of recordings, could you describe the use of autonomous recording units in the great gray owl surveys? Are they being used, and if so, how are they working out?
Yeah, so they've been used for great gray owls, and they are working. I know my colleagues at Teton Raptor Center are using them with, it seems like a great amount of success right now. We in Wyoming, we actually had a proposal to do some of that work. Well, what we wanted to do was put this next summer ARUs out in some of those areas in the low elevation portion of the Northern Sierra. That seemed like a great fit because we could do it less expensively and cover a large area. But that project the funding hasn't worked out. So it's absolutely doable, and it would be great to see a lot more of that going on.
Wonderful. We have a question from the live stream by Jerry. Great presentation. Were GPS tracked birds followed in the non-breeding season? If so, did they move away from the breeding territories?
Yeah, so this is that non-breeding season right now. So we are continuing to download data from those birds. The tags hold the data, and then we just have to get close to the birds with an antenna that grabs the data. There's folks in Yosemite are working on periodically getting out there and downloading data on those birds when they can find them in the winter. Even if they can't find them, we should be able to get them in the spring. So the hope is, yeah, we'll have movement. We'll have information on their movements next spring from throughout the winter. A little bit of work like this has been done with a lower tech system with sort of old-fashioned VHF telemetry, where it doesn't involve GPS, but literally involving ground tracking of animals, has been done in Yosemite about 15, 20 years ago. And the finding there was that the lower elevation meadows, the birds at those meadows tended to stick around year round, but the birds at higher elevation meadows in the park were migrating down slope in the winter, like 3,000 feet down slope. But there was a small sample size too. So, and it was only 1 year, maybe two.
Let's see. Oh, Yvonne asks, in the great gray owls that are killed on the roads, is it a preponderance of juveniles or all ages?
It seems to be all ages. I haven't looked at this systematically, but that's my sense from the data I've seen. I know it's all ages. Whether there's a preponderance of young birds is a good question, which probably somebody has looked at, but I don't remember.
Okay, wonderful. Let's see, we have John and Erica. When surveying, do you use sound recording devices to find the owls?
Yes, that is exactly what we do. We use sound broadcasting devices to find the owls. Playing the owls' vocalizations very, very minimally. The idea is you don't want to blast them with a lot of sound, but you need to do just enough to realistically mimic what another owl would do. And that's how we do it.
Okay.
And then a lot of visual observing is a piece of it as well. And great gray owls are somewhat crepuscular. They hunt in the early morning and in the dusk before it gets dark. And so visual surveying of appropriate habitat is an important part of looking for these guys.
Okay. Lance asked, for ARU surveys, please consider a crowdfunding approach. It might work. Following up on the success of Project Snowstorm in the eastern part of the country for snowy owls.
Nice. That's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Let's see, we have another question. Mary asks, is there any interaction between great gray and barred owls?
Well, we are fortunate in the great gray owls range in California. Barred owls have just barely gotten into the Central Sierra. We have had barred owls down there, but only a few. So the numbers are still too low. I don't know of any interaction that has been documented. It's certainly possible, and I don't know about elsewhere in the range where in both species range where the overlap has been substantial for a long time.
Great, thank you.
Fantastic. I think we're running out of questions.
I think we have run out of questions, unless there are more that are being typed furiously at the moment.
You might want to take a quick look through the chat.
Let's see.
Well, are there internship opportunities for the students on the call who
Oh,
want?
yeah, thank you for mentioning
Yes.
that. So the Institute for Bird Populations hires lots of seasonal biologists. We recruit paid positions for people who have skills that we're looking for. We also have a lot of full-time volunteer positions that are appropriate for students. They typically start, well, there's a whole range of positions on lots of different species, not just great gray owls, songbirds, lots of different things, and spread out across the country, although most predominantly in the West. A lot of the positions start too early in the season for students, but there are some that won't start until June or just the very last days of May. Particularly this year, we're going to have some positions for little flycatcher surveyors and northern goshawk surveyors that are appropriate for students who can get out in the field by the end of May or the beginning of June. So I encourage anybody interested in a summer position, whether paid or volunteer. And I should say too, even our volunteer positions, we do provide a per diem for some living money and also free housing. So you're not entirely on your own. But we give lots of training. It's a great experience. So I encourage you to go to birdpop.org and then just click on the jobs tab. And there's a whole bunch of positions that we are busily trying to fill right now. I mean, the positions aren't happening right now, but we're filling them in preparation for the spring and summer.
That's great. Thank you so much.
That is fantastic. Mark, I think I grabbed just about everything out of the chat.
Okay.
And
Wonderful.
Dr. Rodney Siegel, thank you very much. That was a wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you. It was my pleasure.
And
Thank you so much.
yes. And
We're looking forward to hearing more results in a few years and all the GPS tagging. That's going to be really a fantastic data set, I'm sure.
You bet. Thank you.
yeah, that was very, very interesting.
Great.
And for everyone out there, there's a lot of great birding happening in the next couple of weeks. Some lab is ramping up their field trips. Starting in January, we have field trips already planned through the first third of the year or so. So please check. You'll be receiving lab members will be receiving email notifications. And this is it. We're finished. It's a wrap for 2022.
Okay.
Thank you, Rodney.
Yeah.
Thank you very much,
Thank you.
Rodney.
Thank you,
And
Ron and Mark.
and happy holidays to everyone. Have a wonderful new year, and we'll see you in 2023. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
And thanks again.
Thank you again, Rodney.